Good morning. In the run-up to today's scripture, it has become final exam time for Jesus and his disciples. They have come to Caesarea Philippi, which is probably the biggest center of political leadership outside of Jerusalem. And there, Jesus says to his disciples, particularly to Peter, "Who do people say that I am?" And raises the question that remains before the world today. Who is Jesus Christ? Who do people say that I am? And gets the answer. Well, some say you are John the Baptist. Some say you are Elijah, and there's some who say you're another prophet. And you get the sense that the answer is not complete. And who do you say that I am? You have been with me for 3 years, and you have watched me and heard me, and you have done what I have done and said what I have said. Who do you say that I am? Time for the verdict. If it's B, I would sort of stare and say, "You speaking to me? You want me to answer this question?" And I appreciate that my namesake, Peter, the fellow who leaps into seas when Jesus approaches him, blurts it right out. Well, I think that you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Oh, okay. Who is Jesus Christ? In my studies, I have encountered a version of Jesus Christ in each of the world's religions. I've encountered several of them within Christianity. I've encountered the Beach Boys Jesus, the Nazi Jesus, the fundamentalist Jesus, and a version of Jesus Christ in virtually every other philosophy or cultural movement that exists. Because somehow, whereas this does not seem to apply to any other religious leader, Jesus Christ has to be co-opted to somebody's agenda somewhere, sometime. You have to deal with him. You have to do something with Jesus Christ in a way that I simply haven't seen with regard to, for instance, Winston Churchill. Who is Jesus Christ? Who is Jesus? Is he the Christ? For the name Christ is not a last name, that's a title. The title of the one sent from God. Most of the answers given to the question, who is Jesus, that depart from what the apostles who walked with him said, do three things. One, they pull him out of history, so he becomes an ascended master or somebody who was simply assumed into heaven so that he shuffled off the historic life of his people. He got an out. The second thing is that his cross is somehow removed. This is not universal, but in most places the cross is a stumbling block. If you could just do without that, it's a stumbling block certainly for Peter in this passage. If we could just do without that, a lot of people could buy Jesus, but not the cross. And the third thing that happens is that you amputate Jesus Christ from Jewish history. When it is said that he is the Messiah, that is a direct connection to prophecy in the Old Testament concerning the one who would come to be for Israel, before God, the one true servant, the one who would suffer on behalf of his people and who would deliver his people and who would become unto them the righteous ruler that others had not been. That this one was sent from God, but it was also utterly human. You have to chop that part off. I'm always amazed, pardon me for a reference to my own tradition, when you ask fundamentalists, who is Jesus? They always answer, the one who came for me. Now, that's true, but only in the second place. St. Paul says, to the Jew first, and then to the Gentile. Usually the person answering is a Gentile. But the Jewish portion of it is eliminated. But if you want Jesus Christ in time, space, and history, and established in Jewish history as he is, and the one who actually suffered death on the cross as it appears he did, you are left with a witness of the people who he asked this question first: who is Jesus Christ? And you're left with their answer. You are the Christ. As soon as Peter utters that, Jesus said, "You're blessed, Peter." And he says, "On this rock I'm going to build my church." And there's a question as to whether that refers to Peter or to his confession, but it doesn't matter. Because Peter walks away with the idea, he's going to build a church on me. I'll give you the keys to the kingdom. What you bind on earth will be bound. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Wow. This is big stuff. I got one right answer and I won the lottery. Here we go. And he did one other thing. He said, okay, we've talked about the Messiah. You get the right answer. Everybody shut up. You don't tell anybody. Why is that? Well, we're about to find out, because everybody's got their own idea of what the Messiah is. You get the one right answer and you assume everything else you assume is right. Maybe not. So let's shut down the discussion, and from that point on, here we go into our text, then Jesus made it clear to his disciples that it was now necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, submit to an ordeal of suffering at the hands of the religious leaders, be killed, and then on the third day be raised up alive. That appears to have been the second question. Seriously. When it says Jesus made it clear, it is quite likely that means that he showed them from his study of the Old Testament that the one sent from God must suffer, that suffering is inherent in this and therefore will not be an accident. It will be central to things because it is now necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the place where it will heat up. They are talking in Caesarea Philippi. That's fine. That's several kilometers to the north. But in Jerusalem, you start talking like that, trouble will arise pretty quick. If you start talking about it on the way, a whole lot of people who think they know what you mean will join in and muddy up the whole business. And there is a mission to be accomplished that can't stand to be muddied up. And what's all this about suffering? And why is it necessary to the Messiah? I think he showed them one other way. He simply did a little bit of preaching in a certain place or two and discovered and revealed to the disciples that people don't like, not all people like, who Jesus is and what he says. It reminds me of some of our attitudes towards doing good. Let us feed the poor. Do you realize that when you feed the poor in some places you make people angry? Because the poor you are feeding are their enemies. They want those people to starve. You are therefore their enemy because you wanted to feed them. Ask the question, why can't we feed the world? That's one of the answers. And that's one of the things Jesus could have revealed very easily to his disciples. The things I say don't make everybody happy. Some people get mad. Some people resist. But he wants to focus on what the disciples themselves will understand, and that's where we need to go. So Peter, hearing this, and I think realizing that he's got the keys to the kingdom, took Jesus in hand and protested, "Impossible, Master, that can never be." And uses the same word that occurs when Jesus said, "Whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven." I forbid it. You are the master, but I forbid it. Interesting comment, isn't it? It's like talking back to your mother. You know that's not going to last very long. But Jesus didn't swerve. Peter, get out of my way. Satan, get lost. Now, the comment that comes out of there is the one that says, "Get thee behind me, Satan," in the old King James, and you may have heard that expression. It is used whenever anybody encounters temptation. Get thee behind me, Satan. It's been trivialized to the point where it usually means somebody is offering you chocolate or something like that and you're on a diet. But Jesus is dead serious when he looks at the same man who got the answer right and who heard him pronounced blessed. In the space of a moment, his name is mentioned with Satan's, which means that getting one answer right is not enough. May I make an appeal to you? Jesus Christ, you may have encountered and you may have discovered that there is a life-changing component to faith in Jesus Christ. That's great. I'm glad. But he calls you to follow, and there's a lot you don't know. Running off with one good idea about Jesus Christ may not be the best idea. Peter tried it and found himself lumped in with Satan as a source of temptation and as a source, later it will say, a stumbling block that leads other people astray, because people fall over a rock that's in the way. You have no idea how God works. Let me pose another question. Do you? Somebody walked up to you into the street and said, "How does God work?" Would you have an answer? And would it come out of your lived experience of obedience to Jesus Christ? That's the question. What do we know from our life experience of the way that God works? Then Jesus went to work on his disciples. I love that expression. Jesus went to work on his disciples. Time is short. We are heading shortly for Jerusalem, and Jesus went to work on them. I think they were up late at night. We're not done here, is the message. Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. What does that mean, Lord? Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Excuse me. The expression that you might have heard that has entered into classic discourse is, take up your cross, and follow me. Now, when anybody was going to be crucified, somebody carried the crossbar. That was a big, heavy piece of wood. So it implied that somebody was entering in some way into the suffering of another person. Take up your cross and follow me, expressed here by don't run from suffering. Now, suffering has a lot of sources. So what Jesus is referring to is suffering that comes as a direct result of following me, which won't happen to you if you're not. And you will not discover how God works in the world. Pretty stiff stuff, isn't it? Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Follow me, and I'll show you how. Self-help is no help at all. The thing that Jesus fears the most about the crowds around him is that they believe a little bit about him, they liked a little bit of food that they had, and they're fully willing to invest in him all their hopes for their kind of deliverance, and will gladly follow him right off the pathway that God has called him on. You can get a crowd in a moment. Getting the crowd to follow is another story. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, of finding yourself, your true self, or as it is expressed here, your soul. And teaches something about the ways of God that are so counterintuitive they need to be affirmed here. If you are trying to find out who you are and to develop your soul, your person, your being as the main focus of your life, at the end of things, you may discover you lost what you tried to gain. That personhood is actually a gift acquired while you were pursuing something else. What kind of a deal is it to get everything you want but lose yourself? In my culture, getting everything you want is yourself. And Jesus said, no, not so. What could you ever trade your soul for? In 1961, in the southern part of the United States, freedom marches began, and freedom riders sprung up to support them. Freedom marchers were largely African Americans marching against discrimination, often being attacked on the basis of a long history of being killed, and nevertheless objecting in acts of civil disobedience, peaceful but nevertheless disobedient to the kind of treatment that they had been given. And critical mass had been reached in other populations that were not black that said, we have to support this. And so freedom riders got on buses that began to head down, and the authorities began to realize this population would only swell, the objection would get greater, and people far away from this would begin to understand what was going on. So they began to resist it. And they began to beat and confront and stop the freedom riders to the point where each one of them that got on the bus, even if they got on the bus somewhere in Ohio heading south, made out their last will and testament before they departed on the trip. This could be a one-way trip. You better believe in what you're doing and decide what to do with your stuff. Because not everybody comes back from this. There is an aspect to that, it seems to me, that causes a person to realize what's in their soul, what matters to me more than anything else in the whole world. You don't get that because you sat down and thought about it. You got that because you sacrificed it. And you had to ask, for what will I lay down my life? Even if laying down my life is an incremental sacrifice that goes along again and again and again throughout an entire lifetime, or it's getting in the way of a bullet, one way or the other. Jesus said, only through suffering will you find out who you are. Only through that process of following me into it. I'm not talking about creating suffering that was just plain stupidity or selfishness. We are talking about entering into the struggle in the world in which God is deeply engaged and for which his Son came to die and rise. That's where you're going to find out who you are. You know, why couldn't Jesus just be a good moral teacher that talked about how to be nice? It's interesting where we raise crosses, by the way. Somebody pointed out that at 9/11, when those planes flew into the Twin Towers down there at the base of Manhattan, and those buildings collapsed, and their steel structure was left exposed, two pieces of steel forming a cross remained upright over the whole mess. And everybody said that was utterly appropriate for a cross to be erected there. But somebody else commented, why was it not appropriate for the cross to be erected over the buildings when they weren't in a mess in the ground? Why is it that only when there is tragedy or when there is loss do we erect crosses? Why don't we say to ourselves, the cross is a part of daily life? I follow Jesus to business. I follow Jesus to work. I follow Jesus on my holidays. And I identify with the suffering of the world wherever I go. For when I do, I begin to discover how God works in the world. Jesus continues to say, don't be in such a hurry to go into business for yourself. Now, he's not referring to whether you open Tim Hortons outlet. He is talking about the do-it-yourself faith that gets a little idea of Jesus, but then decides to follow my own good ideas afterwards, and does not pursue the knowledge of Christ deeper and deeper into life. Don't be in such a hurry to go into business for yourself. Before you know it, the Son of Man will arrive with all the splendor of his Father, accompanied by an army of angels, and you'll get everything you have coming to you, a personal gift. Now, this is the church anticipating the return of Christ, which we still anticipate, thinking that it's coming sooner than it came. Nonetheless, the emphasis on simply this: the things you are looking for will come to you as a gift rather than an achievement. You will discover who you are because it has been brought to birth in you by forces you were not looking for. And when you do, you would not trade that for anything. As it says elsewhere in the scripture, when he comes, we will know who we are. For we have been actively engaged in becoming like him in his struggle in the world. When he appears, it'll be like, oh, yeah. Not only out there, but in here. Do you believe that? Because if you do, it changes fundamentally what your attitude is towards the world, to its suffering. It makes it really hard to just shake your head and say, somebody should do something. I want to close with this. In Rwanda, early 90s, an unspeakable genocide took place. I don't think the world has been able to take it in. And part of the reason for that is we don't take Africa seriously. In 100 days, 1 million people died. That was not... That was an appropriate chord, I think. Jean-Paul Samputu was a Tutsi. He was among the people targeted for death. And when it became obvious that that was going to happen, his father said, flee, and he did, leaving his family in the care of his best friend, Vincent. And while he was gone, Vincent killed his family. Jean-Paul was a musician, but in order to deal with the anger and the hatred and the confusion, he began his pursuit of addictions and lost everything in the process. In his own words, he said, I wanted to kill Vincent, and since I couldn't kill Vincent, I started to kill myself. Do you hear echoes of Christ? There is a way to lose your soul in this world. It is the pursuit of everything that seems intuitive to you, even if that's evil and wrong. It nevertheless seems utterly right, and the pursuit of that begins to destroy you. Happens all the time. I see it. I see it all the time when there is an awful murder or something like that, and we breezily say that person is evil and hunger for their death. I want to ask myself, you pursue that as far as you want in Canadian culture, what will we be and where will we be? After 9 years of destroying himself, he went back to his village where they have what they call a traditional court. Now, I wish we could learn from Africa. You know, Truth and Reconciliation Commission that costs billions of dollars and takes decade upon decade upon decade to finally screw up the courage and the organization to put together so that we confront some of the evil things that we've done. They have a traditional court in every village. If someone has wronged you, you can confront them in that court and forgive them. Why do they have that kind of intelligence? We lack it. So he went to the traditional court and called Vincent there and publicly forgave him. And it was said of the event, it is a negation of the humanity of the perpetrator to take another human's life, but it is an affirmation of both to forgive. Forgiveness is the long, agonizing entrance into a second level of suffering. The first is with the loss. The second is with the release of the one who caused it. And the long, hard business of dealing with yourself. Never think forgiveness is either quick or easy. But what Jesus said is if you pursue that path, expressed here through forgiveness, there's 100 other places, and you enter into that, you will discover what it means to follow me. You'll find out how God works in the world. And you will gain your own soul. Samputo finished with this. People often think that forgiveness is a gift to the offender, but forgiveness is for you, not for the offender. Where, if I just started from where you are right now, where I am, and drew a straight line that paralleled the choices we make, the behavior we're following. Are we following Jesus? Is that leading us in that direction? Because if it is, your soul lies ahead of you. What if it isn't? What will you do today? God bless you.